Robyn, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are and go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. It's great to be chatting with you. I am coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. So this is my home office in Melbourne. And I work at a place called Pilgrim Theological College, where I'm Associate Professor of New Testament. It's a consortium of colleges within the University of Divinity. I'm also an ordained Uniting Church minister, so I sometimes preach and do a fair bit of teaching in the wider Uniting Church and church context as well, in and around Australia. Yeah.
Very good. And when you're not writing books or teaching or solving the great problems of the world, how do you spend your time? What do you do day in and day out?
I do a few things to relax. I have a couple of retrievers, so we're often walking the dogs. I love hiking in the bush, and then to balance that physical exercise, I also really like to bake. So cooking, making things in the kitchen is a form of relaxation for me.
Got it. Well, it sounds good. And I mean, writing a book is not too different than baking in its own way, that you're bringing lots of pieces together and you hope all of the various ingredients, and I'm really stretching here, but we're gonna work with it.
We can.
What prompted you to want to write this book?
There are a couple of things. I lived in America for a long time and came back to Australia right in the midst of Australia having a big public debate about same-gender marriage. And for American listeners, Australia is a very secular country. We do not have our politicians talking about faith or the Bible in public. They kind of really almost hide that. And yet all of a sudden we're having these debates where people are quoting the Bible and talking about, well, the Bible says this and the Bible says that. So I partly wrote this book because I'm seeing religious discourse, and this has been shown by research now, has increased rapidly, even as church attendance is declining in mainstream churches. And I think there is a great need for people to kind of understand more what the Bible is and how we might read it well. But the other reason I wrote this book is the people I meet when I speak in churches. I've met a lot of young adults that are moving out of those very conservative church spaces. So I think evangelicals is one of the words used.
Right.
People who are, asking questions. They're moving away from fundamentalism, and they kind of want to know, well, I still take the Bible really seriously, but what do I do with it? Like, what are the tools? And I wanted to write something that might help those people, be able to say, think about what their assumptions are about the Bible, what they've been taught, have a look at what the Bible really is, what it says about itself, what we find when we read it with an open mind, and to give them some kind of simple questions they can ask of any passage as a kind of guide to interpreting it ethically and faithfully.
Right. In terms of your own interest in deciding to do it from your location, you mentioned being in the States and then going back to Australia, and there's this kind of lively public debate. And from where you sit, you think, okay, I want to voice in this conversation. I want to enter into this conversation. And so can you help those who are listening get a little bit broader sense of where you come from in the sense of academically where you come from, and so I have some things I could say, but I'm interested to hear you describe your journey to the place where you think to yourself, okay, I've spent my life studying the Bible at a high level, and now I want to write this book. So
I mean, my journey's been interesting in that in my teenage years, I was very influenced by conservative evangelical churches and church groups, campus ministries. I started going to what we would now call a mega church. That was not the language at the time, but a big Baptist kind of evangelical church. And really went off to seminary as a 20-year-old, pretty conservative in my faith, and had that experience so many people have of having their minds blown by learning about the history and the context of the Bible. That led me on a path where I met you, Trevor, at the University of Chicago Divinity School.
Right.
I realized I'd gone into ministry and I just loved the Bible teaching part of it. In congregational ministry, I just wanted to do Bible studies with people. And so I went to Chicago and did my PhD in a a place that, as you know, is super academic, rigorous. You can kind of hide in the intellectual. And really, I mean, I say in the beginning of this book, in some ways, this is a book I've been thinking about for 25 years. I just didn't quite know it, because this is a kind of me putting it back together, that sort of young me with just an evangelical, sincere desire to read the Bible and love it, and the intellectual part that deconstructed all of that and made it very difficult for me to do that in some ways. So, yeah. That's part of my journey.
That makes a lot of sense to me, because I, as you just mentioned, my first encounter with you is in this very high-end, very intense academic environment, and I mean, the Robyn that I met in that context is a Robyn who could speak and write and think at the very highest levels. And you've written a significant monograph, a high-priced monograph that sits in university libraries all over the world. But the other thing that has always stood out to me about you as a person, Robyn, that is reflected in this book, is the desire, as you were just saying, for people to actually understand the Bible. That it's not just, this is what I've spent years, as I've learned Greek and Hebrew and the other languages that I've learned, but a real desire to kind of reach down. And so that leads to the question of, for those people who encounter this book for the first time, or maybe even if you are the ideas in the book for the first time, or maybe even if you think about yourself as that young seminary student, kind of bright-eyed, going to change the world, all of those kind of things. What do you hope that reader comes away from the book thinking, feeling, wondering?
Great question. I think one of the things I want them to come away with is that it's not only okay to ask questions, it's what we should be doing. Like grappling, interrogating the text. I mean, when I use this language in class, it makes some students nervous, but we should be bringing our whole selves into conversation with the Bible. It's one of the things I talk about. So asking questions, saying, how does this make sense in the modern world, in the ancient world, within the passage I'm reading? I think, there are so many church traditions that discourage that. And one of the things I hope people realize is that's a great thing to do. That is actually a faithful thing to do, to be asking questions. It's not a sign of doubt or lack of faith. The other thing I hope people go away with is that, to take the Bible seriously, and I notice you have this quote on the screen, is not to take it literally. So some of the rhetoric we get is that unless you read the Bible a certain way, you're not a real Christian, or you've dismissed the authority of the Bible. So I kind of talk about various ways we can think about authority, and that there is a way to really honor the Bible if you're seeking to be a faithful Christian, that is not about being literal about it. And I guess lastly, I would say, and this is sort of giving away where I end up, but people can still read the book. I really just pose some simple questions. I argue for an ethic of love, and that if we read any Bible passage, we can ask a simple question like, how does this help me love my neighbor more? And if we're interpreting a passage in a way that does not help us love, but actually leads us to harm or hate, I would say that goes against the fundamental ethic of Jesus' teaching and what we find across the scriptures. So I wanted to leave, your average Christian who might never have the privilege or be able to afford to go to seminary or any kind of theological or religious study, a couple of simple questions that they could ask and sit with that might just help them find the Bible useful for life.